You want to cut through the noise and understand the big forces shaping our world, right? You're not alone. That's why we're diving deep today into Ray Dalio's principles for dealing with the changing world order. Think of it as your cheat sheet to centuries of economic and political history.
Exactly. Dalio has, sifted through the rise and fall of empires to find these recurring patterns.
Yeah.
Our goal here is really to extract the crucial insights, give you a clearer picture of why things are the way they are, and maybe where they're headed.
And this isn't just like one person's opinion, is it?
No, not at all.
Dalio's framework comes from this massive data analysis done at Bridgewater Associates. They're tracking a staggering amount of information.
Trying to pinpoint the underlying drivers of
Yeah.
these huge historical cycles. Precisely. But, and this is really crucial, Dalio himself cautions these are observed patterns,
Right.
Not guarantees of the future.
Right. No crystal ball.
Exactly. We're here to explore potential pathways based on history, not, make definitive predictions.
Okay. So, if we're looking at that big picture, what are the key cycles Dalio says are most important for understanding today's global shifts?
Well, he highlights three main interconnected ones. First, there's the long-term debt and capital market cycle. The natural rise and fall of credit, investment, the financial system.
Got it.
Second, the internal order and disorder cycle. So the forces that either unite a nation or will divide it.
Internal cohesion or lack thereof.
And third, the external order and disorder cycle. That's the shifting power dynamics and conflicts between countries.
Okay, let's start with the first one then. Dalio talks about an archetypical big cycle. What are the main stages of that? Can you walk us through it?
Yeah, sure. It basically unfolds in three broad phases. It starts with the rise. This typically follows some period of significant upheaval, like a war or revolution. You see low debt levels, the gaps in wealth and values are relatively small. There's a strong sense of national unity, cooperation.
Sounds pretty good.
Yeah. Innovation, good infrastructure, education, strong, effective leadership, and usually a peaceful international scene led by dominant powers.
That sounds like a real sweet spot in history. But inevitably, things change, right? What comes next?
Well, then you get to the top. And the tricky thing is, the very prosperity of the rise can sow the seeds of its own decline.
How so?
Debt starts to pile up. Those wealth and political gaps start to widen. And people might start focusing more on short-term gains instead of, long-term health.
Ah, okay. And that sets the stage for the downturn.
Exactly, the decline. This phase is often marked by financial troubles,
Yeah.
stemming from all that debt that built up. You also see large, destabilizing gaps in wealth and values, which fuels internal conflict. Leadership might weaken.
And the whole world order starts getting challenged.
Yeah, the existing world order starts to be challenged by rising powers. And look, this isn't a unique event. Dalio stresses it's a recurring drama throughout history. Think about the stagflation of the 1970s or the global financial crisis in '08. Those had textbook decline symptoms, right?
Yeah.
Financial strain, social unrest.
Right, that combination.
Yeah.
So what are the fundamental factors, the determinants that decide if a nation thrives or falters? He mentions quite a few, 18, I think.
He does, yeah. It's a comprehensive list. But we can maybe focus on a few key examples to illustrate, like education, character, and innovation. Dalio argues a strong education system, one that also cultivates character, work ethic, is foundational.
Okay, makes sense.
Because that fuels innovation, right?
Okay.
Makes a nation more competitive globally. Look at the Dutch Republic back in its golden age. Their breakthroughs in shipbuilding, developing early capitalism, that propelled them.
Right.
And interestingly, Dalio points out that today, if you look at the U.S. and China, they have pretty comparable levels of economic output and shares of global trade. Suggests a similar kind of competitiveness, at least in certain areas.
That does give you pause for thought. What about the factors that signal trouble ahead? The danger signs?
Okay, a critical one is what he calls the drive to gain and keep wealth and power. Basically, a nation needs to earn at least as much as it spends over the long haul.
So deficits are a problem.
Persistent deficits are a major red flag, yeah. Another is favoring short-term gratification of long-term well-being. The temptation to go for immediate benefits can worsen the cycle, especially through unsustainable debt increases that eventually lead to painful corrections.
And governments are prone to that?
Well, yeah. Facing constant political pressures, they're particularly susceptible to that kind of short-term thinking.
We definitely see that tension between short-term needs and long-term consequences playing out. What else contributes to a nation's decline?
Big wealth gaps, significant wealth disparities, and the social friction that comes with them are crucial. When the gap between rich and poor gets too big, it often ignites internal conflict. Dalio talks about left versus right populism. Historically, this can lead to higher taxes on the wealthy, capital flight, sometimes even threats to democratic institutions. He contrasts, the relatively peaceful reforms under Roosevelt in the U.S. during the 1930s with the much more violent upheavals in places like Germany, Japan, Spain, Russia, China, all around the same time, driven by similar underlying pressures.
And the role of debt in all this, it seems central, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The debt and money cycle is really at the heart of it. I mean, debt and credit can boost growth, obviously, but eventually those debts have to be dealt with. Central banks, they can create more money and credit, right?
Right.
But that often leads to inflation. And ultimately, you need some kind of painful debt deleveraging or restructuring.
Right.
Dalio sees Nixon's 1971 decision taking the U.S. off the gold standard as this pivotal moment. It fundamentally changed how our monetary system works.
How so?
Well, he's talked about how he was initially surprised by the market's reaction back then, and it pushed him to really dig into these long-term historical money and credit cycles. It basically decoupled money supply from a physical constraint, gold. Gave central banks more flexibility, sure, but also opened the door for potentially greater inflation and debt buildup over the long run.
A dynamic he sees as central now.
Exactly. And then tied into that is the huge advantage of having the world's reserve currency.
Yeah.
What does that actually mean, though? So a reserve currency is basically the currency that's most widely held by central banks around the world. It's used for international trade, finance.
Like the U.S. dollar today.
Precisely. And the nation issuing it gets significant benefits like lower borrowing costs, more influence on global financial flows. It's a big deal.
But it doesn't last forever.
History suggests not. All past reserve currencies have eventually lost that status, and often the transition is disruptive. Painful.
Which obviously raises questions about the dollar's long-term future and what might replace it, if anything.
It certainly does. It gives the issuing country immense leverage, so losing it is a major shift in power.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. The internal order and disorder cycle. Dalio outlines 6 stages, and he likens it to the progression of an illness. That sounds, pretty dramatic.
It can be, yeah. The stages kind of map out a potential progression. Stage 1 is basically when a new order is established, institutions start strengthening. Stage 2 is a period of peace and prosperity.
At good times.
Right. Then stage 3, you start seeing excesses develop, imbalances creep in. Stage 4 is when economic conditions worsen, people might feel poorer, even if they aren't technically, debt often rises.
Okay.
Then you get to stage 5, which Dalio believes is particularly relevant today. That's marked by severe financial difficulties and really intense social and political conflict.
And stage 6.
Stage 6 is the low-point civil war or revolution, the breakdown of internal order.
Wow. Okay, let's focus on stage 5, intense conflict. You said Dalio thinks that resonates now. What are the signs?
Yeah, he points to things like increasing animosity, real tension between different social classes or groups. The weaponization of media is a big one. Traditional social media used to attack and demonize opponents.
We see plenty of that.
The potential for legal systems, law enforcement to be used as political tools, the growth of private security forces, a rise in violent protests. He even cites data, like Gallup polls showing this significant drop in public trust in the media over decades, affects even established news sources.
And when trust erodes like that?
It makes it incredibly hard to find common ground, right, to even agree on basic facts. That's a huge challenge for any society. It's quite striking how his description of stage 5 seems to mirror some of the divisions we're seeing right now.
It really paints a sobering picture. Okay, turning outwards now, how nations interact. The external order and disorder cycle conflicts between countries.
Right. This involves wars between nations. Dalio breaks them down into 5 main types. You've got trade or economic wars, technology wars, geopolitical wars, struggles for influence, capital wars, fights over investment flows, and then finally, military wars.
And where does he see the U.S. and China in that framework?
Well, he argues the current U.S.-China relationship involves the first 4 types right now.
Trade, tech, geopolitics, capital.
Exactly. Not necessarily at extreme levels across the board, but clearly intensifying.
You've certainly seen the back and forth on trade and tech intensify.
Indeed. And the competition for global influence, the geopolitics, the flow of investment, it's all part of it. Dalio points to things like the prisoner's dilemma concept in international relations, where mistrust can lead to escalation, and the risk of tit-for-tat responses spiraling.
Which can be dangerous.
Very. And he specifically flags Taiwan's sovereignty as a particularly dangerous flashpoint. He sees it as having the potential to trigger actual military conflict between the U.S. and China.
Especially with China's military buildup in the region.
Right. In fact, he puts the probability of a major war sometime in the next 10 years at around 35%.
Wow, 35%, that's concerning. What are some of the less obvious consequences of a conflict like that, maybe beyond the immediate devastation that his framework might highlight?
That's a stark possibility. To help make these cycles feel more real, maybe we could look at some specific historical examples.
Yeah, good idea.
Okay, think about the Dutch Republic. Their amazing rise in the 17th century. It was driven by innovation, developing a sophisticated financial system. Their currency, the guilder, became the world's first real reserve currency.
But they declined eventually.
Yeah, over time, over expansion, rising debt that contributed to their gradual decline, or the British Empire, fueled by the Industrial Revolution, strong institutions, but eventually they also faced overextension, the rise of new powers like the U.S. and Germany.
Right.
China's different again. A really long period of decline, then this incredibly rapid resurgence, especially since Deng Xiaoping's reforms kicked in around 1980.
And you mentioned governments printing money during crises.
Yeah, that's a historical tendency. When governments face big debt crises, printing money and devaluing the currency is a common, though often problematic, response. Think Weimar Germany, Argentina, more recently.
And that's when things like gold become attractive.
Exactly. Throughout history, gold and silver have often been seen as hard money, something tangible to trust when there's economic instability or a lack of faith in government-backed currencies.
So putting it all together, based on Dalio's analysis, where do the major players stand in these cycles right now? The U.S., China.
Okay, for the United States, Dalio points to some challenging economic and financial cycles, high debt burden, maybe lower expected growth compared to the past,
Yeah.
but the huge advantage is still being the leading reserve currency issuer. That provides a lot of resilience.
And China?
China, he sees as strong in areas like trade, overall economic output, education levels are rising, military capabilities growing, but it still lags way behind the U.S. in reserve currency status. That's a key difference.
What about others like the UK or Europe?
Based on his framework, the U.K. and, say, France occupy less central positions currently in this global power dynamic compared to the U.S. and China.
Okay. So looking ahead then, say the next 10 years, what are the key dynamics we should really be watching closely?
Dalio stresses the interplay between a few things. One is the short-term debt, money, and economy cycle, basically, the regular business cycle.
Okay.
Another is the internal political dynamics unfolding within major nations, especially the U.S. And the third is those escalating U.S.-China tensions we talked about.
Right. Can you give examples?
Well, the current short-term debt cycle, you could argue, really kicked off with all that stimulus back in April 2020. We're still dealing with the consequences of that. Internally in the U.S., the increasing political polarization is critical. He cites studies showing things like rising parental disapproval of kids marrying someone from the other party, or even surveys where disturbingly high numbers wish the other side would just, disappear or worse.
Yeah, those are worrying trends.
They highlight that growing divide. And then externally, that Cold War dynamic between the U.S. and China is playing out across trade, tech, geopolitics, capital flows, and it seems to be intensifying, not easing.
It really underscores how interconnected everything is, doesn't it? These cycles, these determinants, they're constantly interacting.
Precisely. That's what he means when he says history rhymes. The fundamental causes and effects tend to repeat, even if the specific details, the context, differs each time.
And understanding those patterns is key.
According to Dalio, yeah. Understanding these underlying patterns is pretty essential for navigating this evolving world order.
So as we bring this deep dive to a close, what's the key takeaway maybe you'd like our listeners to think about?
Well, maybe this. Considering these historical patterns and the current trends we've discussed, what aspects of the global landscape strike you, the listener, as most concerning, or maybe most promising? And perhaps what unforeseen consequences might pop up from these ongoing shifts in wealth and power?
That's a good question to ponder.
And maybe also, it could be useful to reflect on your own financial situation. In this context, Dalio really emphasizes understanding your personal balance sheet relative to these bigger economic forces.
Right, bringing it back to the individual.
Yeah. Ultimately, this framework, it offers a valuable perspective, I think, for making sense of these really complex global dynamics. And hopefully it encourages all of us to keep thinking critically about the future.